welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Today is June 19th, 2018. Today we're going to be discussing why have borders, and it'll be interactive. You'll be able to put your comments in on the sidebar. But first, let's take a look at what happened during the day. So gold and silver both closed lower. Gold closed down to $12.75. That was down about 3 cents. And silver closed at $16.29. That was down about 14 cents. So the drop in gold was about a quarter percentage point, and the silver drop was about almost 1%. Moving over to cryptos, it was a pretty good day for the cryptocurrencies. Litecoin topped $100 at one point. It's around $98 right now, and that is basically flat on the day. Bitcoin shot up to over 6,800, is trading right now around 67.33. Ethereum at 537, up about 4%. That was the big gainer on the day of the large cryptocurrencies. And Bcash closed over 900. Well, it didn't close. It's trading at 900 right now. Another thing that happened today of note was yesterday we had the Senate congressional hearings meeting with Inspector General Horowitz. Today we had the congressional hearings, and basically both were the same. Just you had senators reading from the report, expressing their outrage over most of the comments that were what they were outraged at the comments made by Strzok. The fact that he was part of the Clinton email investigation and part of the Russian investigation, and they all pointed out the animus that he had towards Trump. And even Horowitz noted, remember, the Inspector General's report only covered the Clinton email investigation, but in the context of covering that did mention that they didn't look at the Anthony Weiner emails because they were already being diverted to start the Russian probe, because that was the insurance policy. So they then asked him today during the congressional meetings also about what's he going to look at in the next IG report, which relates to potential FISA abuses in the Russian investigation. So we'll see where that goes. Really not much to report there, because they basically just brought the guy in front and read to him what he already knew and asked him questions about it. Some of them expressed their dismay that he had not shown or said that there was no finding of bias, when most of them seemed to believe that there was. All right, so let's get to today's topic, why have borders? And I want to use an analogy, not to make a point, because one thing I mentioned in Moronica earlier in the week is that analogies are never perfect. You shouldn't really want to make your points by analogy. You can make your point by analogy so that people understand what you're talking about, but you shouldn't necessarily make your points and try to have them stick, because you can always distinguish between the real thing and an analogy. Now let's take a look now at why do we have borders? And I'm going to use as an analogy a hypothetical. Let's say there's a guy, he lives in Silicon Valley with his wife. He's married, he's got kids, he owns a landscape business, and he makes decent money. His wife is a school teacher, but for Silicon Valley, they really don't do that well, because home prices are well north of $1.5 million. The cost of living is high, taxes are high, and even though he makes a decent living as a landscaper and his wife makes an okay living, but together you would think that the two of them would be doing well, but they're really not. And the guy gets it in his head. One of the landscaping jobs he has, he goes around to the Silicon Valley campuses, and one of them is Google. So he goes to Google, and he realizes, he says to himself, I'd be better off if I worked at Google. So I'm just going to march in there and see if I can get a job. So he brings his kids in his truck, and he shows up at Google, and he says to the kids, stay in a car, I'm going to go get a job at Google. He goes in, and by some fluke or miracle, they actually have a job for him, and he's ecstatic. He comes back out in an hour or two after going through a few interviews. Kid's still in the car, and he drives home. He tells his wife, guess what? I got a job at Google. Remember, his wife is a teacher, and she says, that's tremendous. And he mentions how he went there with the kids. The kids stayed in the car. She's really annoyed at him for having done that, but no harm, no foul. The kids were fine. They stayed in the car, and he got a job at Google. So he's happy. He's told his wife. His wife is happy. Everything worked out. The next day, the wife goes to work, and she tells her fellow teacher what had happened the day before, that her husband, the landscaper, had gone to Google and went in and actually got himself a really good job at Google just by going in, asking for it, and applying for it, and managing to get an interview that day. Well, her colleague decides that sounds great, so she decides, and she's a single mom, and she's not doing that well. She's not in the same position as the landscaper and his wife with the two kids. She's got two kids, and she's a school teacher, and she's not doing well at all. So she decides she's going to go into Google the next day. She's going to bring her kids after school and see if she can get herself a job. So she leaves her kids in the car. She goes inside, and she says, I'd like to have a job here. And then they say, well, have you applied here? And she says, no, but I want to apply right now. So they give her the sheet of paper, and they tell her to come back or look online and take a look at the jobs that might be available. And she says, no, I want a job now. And they said, well, we can't give you a job now. You'd be more than happy to evaluate your candidacy. If there's a job for you, we'll let you know. She says, no. My friend came in here. My wife's friend came in, and he got a job. And she says, well, I'm not aware of that. She says, look, you got to give me a job. I don't make any money. I'm a school teacher here. How do you expect me to live here and teach your kids unless you give me a job here at Google? I know you've got high-paying jobs, and there's free food here on campus, and there's a gym, and I see a lot of people walking around doing nothing. I want a job at Google. And she says, well, I can't help you. I'm not the hiring manager. She says, well, I'm not leaving until I get a job. And then she starts walking into Google, and the security guard tries to stop her. She goes past the security guard. She goes up the elevator, and somehow she gets onto one of the floors and starts asking around for a job. Well, finally, they have called the alarm. They have to remove this woman. Meanwhile, her kids are out in the car, and they take her and they arrest her. And she says, but my kids are in the car. So she says, well, who's staying with them? She says, I don't have anyone. I'm a single mom. Well, they have to take the kids away and put them somewhere while they arraign this woman for her arrest. Well, the next day, it's all over the newspaper that Google is separating mothers from their children, and this woman had come in for a job, and next thing you know, Google has her arrested, and the kids are in the car, and the kids had nowhere to go. They were 6 and 7 years old. It was a real tragedy. They showed the mother crying that all she wants was a job from Google, and Google had her arrested. So Google decides this is bad. We can't do this. We apologize, and they tell their mother, don't worry about it. You come back tomorrow. We'll interview you. We'll get you a job. And we have daycare here for the kids, so you can bring your kids tomorrow. You don't have to leave them in the car when you're having the interview. Google has daycare, and we'll make sure you get a job. Well, now that they've done that, a lot of other people have now heard about it. It's not just the landscaper and his wife, and it's not just the friend of the landscaper, his wife. People now start showing up at Google, and they figure they need jobs. And Google figures, well, we got to undo this bad publicity. So they start allowing people to have jobs. They start finding work for them to do and start paying them salaries. Well, it gets to a point where now all of the underpaid or unemployed people in the area realize they're better off working at Google and getting the daycare and getting the free food during the day, getting the healthcare benefits, and getting the salary that Google pays, than staying at their jobs as firemen, teachers, shop owners, policemen, because those jobs don't pay enough, and Google pays. So they show up, and Google tries to find jobs for them. Well, finally, they realize there's not enough jobs for all the people that show up. Google just doesn't have enough make work. But Google doesn't want to ruin its reputation as a good corporate citizen, so it builds a wing on its campus to house people that come for a job, but there is no job for them, but they'll pay them a salary anyway. And they'll keep them there, and they'll let them use the daycare, and they'll give them the health care benefits. And then people keep showing up and showing up. And finally, Google gets overwhelmed and says, look, we can't have any more people come here to work because we don't have work for you, and we can't afford to pay you the benefits and the health care. And the only jobs we now have are extra security guards at the extra wing that we built, and healthcare professionals and daycare professionals. Those are the jobs that we're hiring for to look after these employees that we've hired that we have no work for, and the employees that they've hired that just do nothing all day except use the services. Well, eventually what happens is Google has to stop this practice in the hypothetical, and they have to close down the wing, and they have to start removing the people. Well, now it gets even worse. It's not just like when, at the beginning of our story, when the landscaper went in with his kids, or the first woman who caused the issue, the teacher went with their kids and they were separated. Now they basically have to ask everyone to leave. And of course, not everyone's going to leave. They live there, basically. And some of the people decide they're not going to leave, and they get arrested. And what happens? The kids do nothing wrong. They don't get arrested. So now the question is, for everyone, yes, I know it's not a perfect analogy, but if a company were to do exactly as I mentioned, and that would be analogous to immigration policy, where you don't necessarily enforce rules, or you don't necessarily have entrance criteria, and you have basically no criteria, you just let people come, and if there's nothing for them to do, well, you figure you let them in, you have to take care of them. And then if they do something wrong, you have to arrest them. But then when you arrest them, you separate them from their kids. So the question is, what can you actually do in this situation? One might say the mistake Google made in the first place, well, the first mistake they made was hiring a guy off the street. The second mistake they made was not telling the woman, the school teacher, that she couldn't get a job. And the mistake wasn't arresting her. The mistake was what they did afterwards, which is try to win public approval by letting other people come and get jobs, and by giving her a job to make up for the fact. That only encouraged other people to come to Google to get jobs. Now, prior to the landscaper showing up, Google had very strict hiring requirements. There were certain grades you had to have. There were certain experience you had to have. They may have had a diversity quota, but still you had to meet the requirements. Once they decided to hire the school teacher just to give her some work, then they abandoned their entrance criteria. They just allowed anyone to come, and they figured they'll deal with it because they didn't want to deal with the negative repercussions of what had happened with the woman who got separated from her children. So almost in a way, they were shamed into accepting all those people as employees when really they didn't have jobs for them. Now, if you just apply that over to a country, and again, we know analogies are never the same, but a country, if it is to have borders, one could argue that it has to have entrance criteria. Otherwise, the country will be in the same position as Google in our hypothetical was, where basically they took people in that they couldn't take in and couldn't afford eventually to take in. And then when they decided they had enough and they were otherwise going to go bankrupt unless they shut this thing down, this program down, they had to deal with the people who refused to accept that they weren't allowed to live there anymore, weren't allowed to work there anymore. And when that happened, they needed to have them removed and arrested. And when they were arrested and removed, not only was there a cost of that, but then there was also a compounding of the original issue, which started the whole problem in the first place, was children got separated from their parents for committing crimes. Now, in the case of Google, and the same with the case of migrants, both circumstances, the parents are trying to find a better life. No one can fault them for that. But once their pursuit of finding a better life becomes a crime, then there's really no alternative, unless I can see in the comments what could possibly be done. Because we saw in the case in the hypothetical with Google, once they tried to say, okay, we know you need a better life, we know you don't make the money you need to make here in Silicon Valley, even doing our landscaping or being our police officers or firemen or teachers, so we're going to give you a job here instead, and we're going to pay you enough so that you can afford to live here. That created a big problem, because it didn't solve the underlying problem. And then basically when they had to take away and they couldn't afford to pay for all these people, they then had to arrest them. And then you have the situation where you're separating the parents from the children. And that's where we are right now in the United States. We have this issue, and it's been there. And what's interesting is it's become an issue just in the last few days. But this issue has always existed. We've had a border law, and it got enforced sometimes and sometimes not. Now they're enforcing it, I think, under this no tolerance. It just means that the more you enforce the law, the more you arrest adults with minor children for violations, the more they're going to be separated. So the question is, what does one do about it? Now, one thing you can do is you can just let everyone in, like Google did, and just say, look, they can all come in, we'll pay for them, we'll let their kids in, and everybody will be happy. And we can try to find work for them, but if we can't find work for them, we'll just make sure that they have housing and their medical bills and enough food to eat. Well, at some point, like as in Google, they realized they would go bankrupt if that's what they had to do. Now, a lot of people would argue in the Google case, well, they could have found work for these people to do. They were a real plus to Google. These are all police officers, landscapers, small business owners, teachers, all people with skills who just couldn't make it in Silicon Valley. Why couldn't they, make it in Google? Why couldn't Google make it work? Putting the onus on them. But Google never really, as a business, signed up to hire people with those profiles. So my point is, I think, if you go to well, I'm going to stop and read the comment here. Poppy says, my folks came in the 60s and need to have a sponsor with $2K in the bank and a note from an employer they have a job waiting for them. Well, that makes sense in the normal contractual way things would happen. See, a lot of libertarians say, well, we need open borders and free movement of people. And well, first of all, we're not talking about people who move. There's two types of movements of people. There's migrants who move just because they know that when they get to the new place, it's like in our hypothetical Google, they're going to get something. They're going to get, maybe not a job, but they'll get benefits, they'll get health care, and then maybe they can get a job. It's not why they come. In the other cases where people move to a country, it's where there's actually a labor need. It's the country that has the need, not the migrant. So when a country has a need for labor, whether it be skilled or unskilled, it can decide that it wants to allow in a certain type of person, either a certain type of, they have seasonal farm work, or they could have PhD work that's required, whatever it is. But I would think that it would be up to the country to decide which types of people, and I don't mean ethnically, I mean which type of skilled people they would want to let into the country. Just as Google, before in our example, used to hire the people it thought it needed to run its business. But what in our hypothetical, which was the downfall of Google, was they brought in people that they didn't need and had really only done it just for public relations and to make themselves look good. So the question is, does a country have the right to behave in a sense like a company? Because companies don't have open borders, they have entrance criteria. If you're going to have countries, shouldn't countries have the right to say which profile of people they could bring in? Now, even in the libertarian free market society, you would still have, if the United States didn't want to take in a certain type of worker, well, in the global free market, there may be another country that would welcome those people. So it's not like the United States is the only place where you could potentially have opportunity. And in fact, if the country says there is no opportunity here, all that's going to happen is you're going to come here and we're going to have to pay for you. Now, forget crime. Now, the other thing is, we're not talking about people. It gets a bit trickier. I'm just talking about people moving for economic reasons. That's why I used the landscaper and the teacher going to Google. They weren't going there because they felt depressed or they were seeking asylum. All they were doing was going to Google because they wanted a better life, and they knew Google paid more than the jobs that they had, and they knew they probably couldn't get a job at Google because they didn't have the requirements that Google wanted to get a job there. They weren't hiring teachers, firemen, landscapers, policemen, shop owners. They had a certain criteria of people that they would hire. So I think in terms of looking at the criteria for, not for migrants, people leaving because they're persecuted or they need asylum or they're fleeing a war, that's an entirely different circumstance. It's an entirely different set of policy issues. I'm just talking about when you view things from an economic perspective, many free market people say you should just let people cross borders and go where the jobs are. But that isn't truly free market, because they don't go to where the jobs are. They go to where the benefits are, which may mean they go to places where there are no jobs, knowing that if there are no jobs, then they can get the benefits from the country. Just as in our example, people went where there really weren't jobs, especially with their skill set, to Google, and they got paid to basically do nothing, and that potentially bankrupted Google in a hypothetical. And I think that's the same thing for a country. A country should be able to decide who comes into their country for economic reasons. Now, if a country wants to have a policy of accepting migrants because they believe it's their moral duty and refugees, that's an entirely separate discussion. Most of the people crossing the Mexican border aren't doing so. Maybe they are now, I don't know, but for the most part, I believe most of the people crossing the border are simply coming because they want a better economic life, and they could find it, they think, in the United States. But I would think it would be up to the United States to say, it isn't here for you, we don't have those jobs. Now, if it is there for them, obviously, then you say, come on in. But not come on in everybody, come on in X number of people with X skills. And this way, you won't have people separated, because right now what's happening is, I believe, people are showing up and just expecting to get in. And if they bring their kids with them, they think, well, we'll definitely get in now because we've got kids with us. So it's almost like I would say it's a human shield, but it's almost like a insurance policy. And then when they get separated, then you have this outrage. So there's really not a solution. I'd like to know if there is one, because, I mean, there are eventual solutions, but I think in the interim, you're going to have a situation where it's not ideal. And I don't know how you make it ideal other than setting up strict criteria so that when people come, fewer people come expecting just to get in. They only come if they know that they're going to get in, and then they can come with their children because they know they're going to be allowed in. Poppy says, if there were no opportunities, then those from other countries would invest in their own countries. Brain drain is a problem for those countries. I think that's true. You see, there's labor issues on both ends of the spectrum in the United States. The United States brings in low-skilled workers and highly skilled workers. And the highly skilled workers, a lot of them are engineers from Asian countries. And that is a brain drain. If people come from China, Vietnam, India, and they get educated in the United States, and then they don't go back to their countries, well, then they've lost all of that. And then you have, on the other end, you have the lower skilled employees or workers, they come, but the issue there is then in both instances, there may be native workers that may want to do those jobs. Now, if a country decides, as a matter of policy, we don't want to have the high paying jobs go to foreigners, so we're going to restrict the number of people from different countries in the schools, foreign born in the schools, and therefore fewer foreign born workers. I think that should be up to them to decide that. Now, even if that is a bad decision, it's the country's decision, and a smarter country, one might argue, may decide that it makes sense to open up their doors in their schools. Think about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in 1949, I believe. The Brooklyn Dodgers made the decision, true free market, that Jackie Robinson, on balance, would help the ball club, and we'd be better off having Jackie Robinson on the team and dealing with the racism than not having him. And as a result, they won because they had Jackie Robinson. So in the free market, a smart country or a smart employer can decide they don't have to abide by. They can make their own choices, and they can live with them, and they can either be positive or negative. Anyway, those are my thoughts for tonight on borders. I'm a believer that you have to have. I mean, you don't have to, but if you're going to have countries, then you need borders. And if you're not going to have countries, then you don't need borders. But you can't have something in between, because if you do have borders, there has to be rules and laws around those borders. And if you have to make exceptions and not enforce the law, that's basically what they want people to do, is say, look, don't enforce the law if someone has kids. Well, that's not fair. That's not equal application to the single person who tries to commit. He gets arrested, and he won't get released to be with his children because he was by himself. And then what happens is some of them say, okay, I don't have kids, but if it'll help me get in, I'll have 2 kidnapped kids come with me. So the whole thing is a mess. I don't have a solution. The only reason I raised it was because I was thinking about if it was a company, it would make a stitch of sense. Now I know, as we talked about in analogies, the analogies are never quite so easily to say that they're parallel, but some of the same issues that in our hypothetical Google had, I think that certainly a country trying to enforce entrance criteria is going to have the same issue. And if they move away from that entrance criteria, they're going to have issues. All right, that's all I have for tonight. Unless there's any questions, we'll see you again tomorrow night. And coming up, we will have, I think Russia reports its gold reserve numbers tomorrow. And I'll have Indian gold imports for the first quarter also coming out. Thanks very much for listening.